See if I can remember how to work the thing. But hi, everybody again in Whiskey Circus. Thanks for coming along again. Today we've got quite an interesting guest. So we've got Stuart Macpherson, who is the Master of Wood, and we'll have no interesting comments on the title before we get going. So he's the Master of Wood for Macallan, but what I'll do, rather than try and introduce him myself, I'll hand over to him personally and say, over to you, Stuart, if you can give us a few words on who you are, what you do, and then we'll go into some questions.
Yeah, no doubt. As I say, my name's Stuart Macpherson. I'm the Master of Wood for Macallan. I've been in the industry 41 years. I started as a cooper. By chance, actually, I wanted to be a teacher and kind of fell into whiskey coopering by chance, basically. And then never really looked back from there. Served my time as a cooper, then went on to run our cooperages in Scotland. Then in 2012, I was asked if I wanted to become the Master of Wood for Macallan. At the same time, I was still running our cooperages. So there was a kind of dual role where it was very much education, as well as looking at operational and production of casks. Then in 2015, I was more involved with our cask suppliers in Spain, bodegas, and generally understanding a little bit more about the specifications that we wanted to impart into the manufacturing of our casks, the influences and impacts that it has on spirit development in general. And then just last year joined the Macallan business unit, focusing on Macallan. So previously it was looking at all of Macallan's brands. And so it's always been in production, it's always been in cask manufacturing.
So the question I think a lot of us have, obviously we all know a lot about Macallan, and we've got quite a couple of people in here that are very big fans of Macallan. And the one thing that strikes me is Macallan was always known for its sherry whiskies, whereas now you are putting that bourbon side in, but the emphasis has always been on the sherry side. So how much influence do you have on the sherry side? I know you don't sort of put the whiskies together necessarily, but it's your job to select the casks and where it's going from there.
Well, basically it starts off in the north, either in the north of Spain or the east coast of America. So we have 4 cooperages in southern Spain who are making casks to our specifications, whether that be Quercus Roba stroke Petrea or Quercus Alba, basically. So your American oak against your European oak. And then kind of working with our cask manufacturers to make sure that the toasting temperatures are correct, the actual seasoning times are correct, the wine is correct that we want to use as well. So we started where we've got auditors who are, I wouldn't say controlling, I mean they're more working and with suppliers and passing on the detail that we believe has an impact and influence on maturation spirit through the casks. So you know, it's not just about Macallan. I mean, when I was running the cooperages, and before Edrington really became Edrington and was Robertson and Baxter back in the days, we were a commercialised cooperage. So we were repairing casks for Diageo, Pernod Ricard, Morrison Bowmore, Ian MacLeod. So all the major distillers companies, we were, you know, repairing casks for their production. But you're right, we did focus more, and we still do focus on sherry. It is very much the kind of driver for the style and the character that Macallan is renowned for.
I mean, one thing that I think sets Macallan apart, or has done for a while. Other distilleries are starting to catch up a bit now. Is you obviously source your wood from the beginning, so I'm assuming you own the wood, and you're getting it from the point of chopping the trees down rather than buying a used cask.
We don't own any forests. We don't
No.
own any wood. I mean, I've known some of these producers in Spain for over 30 years, and it's these relationships that have kind of built up that relationship in terms of where we're sourcing our wood from, the actual manufacturing of the casks, and this whole treatment and seasoning of the wood itself. So the only thing that we ever bought was ex-bourbon barrels, and predominantly the Scotch whisky industry is using that as an infiller to their filling volumes or to their quality of spirit. Everything else, so our sherry casks, as I said, are all made to our specifications.
Yeah. When I say you own the wood, I don't necessarily mean you own the trees, but you go in from the point of the trees being chopped down. Then that you're in charge of where the wood goes, how it's coopered, and things like that.
Yeah. So we give long-term contracts to our suppliers so that they have a vision of what they're trying to source in terms of timber.
Yeah. And so from the point of view gaining access to this wood, I mean, I'm assuming you then go to the forest and see the trees before they're actually chopped, or do you just get the wood once it's cut?
There'll be periodic times where we'll go into the forests to kind of look at the areas and the locations. We don't have an influence over what trees are physically picked. Excuse me. That's really between the landowners or local governments.
Right.
They're actually allowing the trees to be cut.
Yeah. And from what sort of age generally are you looking for in the trees, or what, is it sort of 100, 2 years old, or are you looking for older?
No, I mean, it's probably about 100. It's more about the condition of the trees and what kind of yield you're actually going to get from them. So you would generally be sourcing maybe European oak at maybe 80 plus years, generally older, and it's more about the structural conditions of the trees, more than an age than anything else.
And from a typical tree of that age, then, how many casks would you hope to be able to make from that one tree?
Look, it depends really. It depends on the diameter of the tree. It depends on the length of it before you actually have the lower structural branches coming into the tree itself. So it's quite hard to say how many. There might be some trees where you get one cask. There might be some where you get two. Excuse me. But it then depends on the length of timber that you're trying to cut. Are you cutting that tree for a butt at 500 litres, or are you cutting it for a hogshead?
Yeah.
So really, these suppliers are trying to maximise the yield that they've got from that particular log.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting question that has just come in, which kind of fits into what we're talking about now. It's a two-part question. So one, are you actually planting any trees at the moment for yourselves? And two, do you see any problems because of that age in 20 years or so with forests that might have been destroyed during the wars and things like that?
Well, the first part is no, we don't plant any trees. And there's two reasons to that. I'm very much for natural regeneration of forests, to be honest. I think it's about the management of forests and working with either local governments or landowners to ensure that we do have sufficient enough oaks for the future. The second part of it, there is regular studies done, and one just recently, where it's actually showing there's a growth in the forests.
Right.
Now, there could be a number of reasons for that. Forests might not be maintained and managed, so there's obviously a natural growth. Whether that's actually beneficial to the forest or not, it's questionable, because you're then not letting a lot of these young saplings grow and develop into full-grown oaks later in its life. But any studies that have been done, whether that's in the east coast of America, whether that's in Europe, especially Spain and France, there's sufficient enough volumes of trees for the future.
So with that in mind, then, obviously we know you're using a lot of European and a lot of American oak. What is the difference that you're kind of looking for between the two? So do you approach both the European and the American oak the same when you're trying to buy it, or is it just a total different buying? And how does the difference in wood affect your whiskies?
So generally what happens is that a lot of logging companies will be that intermediate source between a sawmill and a landowner. You've generally got two areas where you're sourcing from, either private landowners or government auction schemes, and I'm talking about particularly in Europe here. And they are controlled. I mean, it's not very much. It's not a case of even if you're a private landowner that you can actually just go in and decimate your forests. There, if you wanted to release part of your equity in the forests, you then have to apply for permits that then will be assessed whether the trees that you want to cut down are suitable. And from then it's a case of, well, can these trees actually be used for whatever purpose? And our purpose then it's cask manufacturing. And it's similar in the US, but there again you've got mixed forests like every forest. And for the Scotch whisky industry, you're only looking for white oaks. So a lot of landowners then, if they see a forest being an asset, and we found this more in the US, where there's maybe red oaks and white oaks, is that if you're not going to take the red oaks because there's maybe not a market for them, then I might not let you access into our forest. We're just going to let these forests develop, if you're not going to take, say, the red oaks for construction, and then allow the white oaks for either bourbon or wine or any cask manufacturing.
So with that then, obviously we know the white oak is used for cask development, but has anybody actually used red oak, or can you use red oak?
Well, for Scotch whisky, it has to be a white oak. So there's three kind of fundamental rules within the SWA, Scotch Whisky Association, is that the spirit must be distilled in Scotland. It must mature in a warehouse for at least 3 years, and it must be a white oak. So,
because it would be interesting to see what the flavour developments would be differential between white and red oak then.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the earlier questions you just asked there was, what is the difference then between, say, a Quercus alba and a Quercus robur or patria? And there is a lot more of a difference. We know that through the chemical structures of these three types of oaks will have an influencing factor on spirit development. So generally people would maybe ask, so, what does a cask have in the influence towards spirit? Well, for me, there's probably three fundamental parts. It's the geographical locations of the oaks, it's the previous use, and it's also cask size, cask shape, and toasting temperatures. Because you have to introduce heat, obviously, into the wood to make it bend and structure it, but as part of that heating process, you're starting to break down some of the chemical compounds that then release some of the flavours that would be associated within some of the spirits that consumers might enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I was kind of leading to get to. So obviously, when we look at the casks and the differentials, we know you're using sherry casks. So I'm assuming you're using both hogsheads and butts.
Yes. So butts, puncheons, and hogsheads.
Yeah. So with that, then you mentioned then obviously the toasting and the charring, the differentials. What exactly difference is there between charring and toasting, and what flavoured profiles will each of them give you?
Well, generally the only people who will be charring is the American bourbon industry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One of the reasons is that bourbon is predominantly maize, so 51% is maize. Maize as a cereal crop is quite sulphury. So when you start to break down the lignins, and that's through then excessive heat, which then creates char, you create a carbon filter, which then reduces some of that sulphury off notes that's associated with maize. Toasting generally is a lot lighter. It's probably a lot longer. So people in the cognacs, wines, whiskey industry are looking for more of these extractives and less of that degradation of the interior surface. So it's generally a toast. And when you've got structural compounds, the main structural compounds in an oak are cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And then you have secondaries like oak terpenes, tannins, and oak lactones.
Yeah.
And it's part of that process, the heat that then starts to break them down, that then creates some of the flavours and that you have through the spirit.
Yeah. And one question that's kind of coming that I'll bring it in now, because it kind of leads us again into part of the question that we're in now. But if Matt wants to ask his question, if he can remember it.
Hello, Stuart.
Hi, how you doing?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I was just wondering, is there any chance of Macallan ever doing any finishes? Port, rum, wine casks, or is that just absolutely ludicrous to ask at?
I would never rule it out. I think it's very much our style just now that we don't do finishes, but a lot of people in the industry now are doing finishes, but for certain reasons. But I think that's part of the new product designs projects that we're working on. That I would never say never, to be honest with you. I think if something interesting comes along, then it's worthwhile experimenting.
And you see, the reason I kind of let that question come in there was because one of the questions I was going to ask was, does the Macallan have any products maturing in any other casks other than sherry and bourbon at the moment? Are we not allowed to know?
I couldn't possibly say, but part of it is, I think, I work with a liquid quality team, so we are looking at innovation. And what does innovation look like? Well, it could be different liquids. It could be oaks from different geographical locations as well. Different toasting temperatures. So I would never say never, to be honest.
But it's a possibility.
Of course.
Yeah. So jumping back to the sherry cask then, seeing as obviously that's what the Macallan is really known for. Obviously in the past, the casks that were mostly used would have been transport casks, which are now we're using season casks. So what's the main difference between them two? And do you sort of recognise that there is a difference between the whiskey coming out of a season cask against what used to come out of a transport cask?
It's probably a question that gets asked quite a bit. Because yes, they were until I think mid-80s. sherry was obviously transported to Europe and the UK in cask, and they were transport casks because basically the bodegas didn't dispose of these seasoning casks that they had, or maturing casks. When that legislation changed, there was obviously a challenge about what did people do to try and get casks. So we stepped in. We were buying our own. We were having our own casks made. If you look at it, there's two different ways to kind of look at it. I think is it a sherry cask or is it a seasoned cask? If it's a seasoned cask, we're probably looking at 12 to 18 months seasoning with an Oloroso wine. Now, with that lower ABV wine and the younger cask or the newer cask, there's going to be more extractives with that new make spirit against that low ABV wine to then influence that spirit. Okay, when we look at sherry casks, you can be looking at anything from 40, 50, 80 years and above. Okay, and generally a bodega will only dispose of them if that cask is no longer suitable or viable for their process. And there has been a lot more, let's say, traditional sherry casks available in the market now, simply because of the reduction in volumes of sherry wines, and obviously the Spanish economy and bodegas closing and casks available. A cask is like a tea bag. The more you fill it, the less you get out of it. So really, from a bodega perspective, the wines, the casks are inert. So they're not actually offering anything to the wine. So for us to then start to use some of these older casks, in my personal opinion, they will have less of an influencing factor on maturing Scotch or maturing spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one misconception that a lot of people have, that is the old sherry casks that were always used for maturing were the Solera casks, which they weren't actually, they were the transport casks. So, and
yeah,
what's the difference? So a typical Solera cask, I believe that would be American oak, wouldn't it? And then the transport cask would have been European oak.
Yeah, that's what it was. Because basically, due to the high level of tannins in European oak, and the bodegas didn't want a lot of new casks because these tannins are generally associated with astringency and bitterness towards a spirit. So having a new cask was detrimental to their wine, and that's why they had older casks. To be honest with you, and it was American oak because it was. Well, back in the day, there would have been challenges. It would have been European oak, but probably from the 20s and 30s when wine was started to take off, or you had the civil wars and destruction of forests. You then started to look at other types of wood, and American oak was more beneficial.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people sort of look at is when we talk about seasoning, and like you've just sort of said there, that 12 to 18 months is sufficient to season a cask. If you were looking at something long term, because I believe you only use first and second fill casks at Macallan. So if you was wanting to go to a third fill, would you need to season longer, or would that really not make a difference?
No, it wouldn't make a difference.
No,
to be honest, no.
No, and obviously the sherry that's used, then I take it this is sherry that's probably going to go to become a vinegar rather than a sherry that's released.
Yeah, it'll be for blending purposes. So the vast majority of wines that are seasoning casks for the whiskey industry, and I'll because obviously there's other brands worldwide who are using sherry casks. That wine is generally for blending purposes. Or it'll be used for sherry vinegar or redistilled back for Spanish brandies.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jens has just come up with a very good point that Oloroso wine is not necessarily the same as Oloroso sherry. So, you know, the difference between what is seasoned in a cask and what is in the supermarkets in a bottle is quite a different product in a sense.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
There's probably no comparison, to be
Yeah.
quite honest with you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think again another misconception with sherry casks and things like that is a lot of people assume all the dried fruits and things like that notes that you're picking up is coming from the sherry, but in sort of reality, it's actually coming from the European oak, and that isn't it?
Correct. This is where, if you looked at it in kind of a pyramid form, and probably you would start with oak species, toasting temperatures, previous use, warehouse locations, and last but not least, sherry. That would be the order in terms of spirit development, to be quite honest with you. Sherry has a very small factor in the development of spirit. It's about wood species and it's about toasting temperatures. You know, if you don't break down the wood sufficiently enough, you don't break down the hemicellulose, some of these, you know, the lignins. You then take it too far, and then you've created char, which then brings itself into other flavour compounds. And generally, that's why the American bourbon market is manufacturing casks, because they're manufacturing these casks to their specifications for the bourbon style that they then want to achieve.
Yeah, yeah. And so with that said then, what is the main contributing factor of, with the European oak where we're getting those dried fruit type flavours, but yet the American oak we're getting the vanillins and things like that, what is the main factor to give us those flavours?
So American oak is more influenced by, oak tannins as opposed to European oak. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, oak lactones, as opposed to European oak being more influenced by tannins than anything else.
And I mean, what is the reason for that though? Is there any particular reason? Is it the growing conditions? Is it just purely down to the style of wood?
I think it's just down to the style of wood, to be honest with you. I mean, it depends which reports you read. I mean, you could read reports that will say there's 500 species of oaks globally, and there's some that's 600 plus. So, generally when we're looking at, cask manufacturing for any type, it will be these three types of oaks: Alba, Robur, and it is, I think, just down to the chemical compounds and structures of these specific species that then deliver the styles and characters.